Seeking Level, Chapter 6. Keith walked out on Allura and right into Shiro, who gripped his shoulders in surprise. "There you are," he said, and Keith just hung his head, waiting. "You're supposed to be resting." "I've heard," Keith responded sullenly. He didn't want to rest. He wanted to do something, get out of here. Allura must have found you, Shiro realized, but how, Keith couldn't guess. He looked away, knowing that Shiro wouldn't need him to confirm. He already knew he was right. He usually was. "I'm taking it you didn't accept her apology?" Keith started walking, not really sure where he was headed. Shiro followed, a steady presence at his side. "It wasn't much of an apology," he returned. "She feels horrible about what happened to you," Shiro defended. "We all know what happened to you," Shiro defended. "We all do, but she's taking all the blame." "Good," Keith replied, feeling deliciously vindictive, holding on to his anger protectively. "Look," Shiro said, his tone turning parental. He was preparing for a lecture. "I know you're worried about Lance, but being angry with Allura isn't going to help him." "Who says I'm worried?" Keith asked, shoving his hands into his pockets. "You do." Keith stopped, staring sideways at Shiro, who was usually right, but not this time. He was angry with Allura because she hadn't listened to him and continued to not listen to him. It had nothing to do with Lance. "It makes sense," Shiro continued. "You're the one who brought him up out of there. It makes sense that you would feel responsible for him. But whatever happens, it's not your fault. And it's not Allura's fault. Lance understood that leaving his lion was a risk. It always is," Keith maintained, unsure why Shiro was coming up with that as an explanation for Keith's behavior. "Of course," Shiro gave in, putting an easy hand on Keith's shoulder. Keith felt oddly patronized. "Come on, let's head back to your room. You still look tired." "No," Keith said, shrugging Shiro off. "I'm going to check on Red first." "Keith, I really don't want to sleep anymore." "Fine," Shiro said. "Just try not to overdo it. No training. Join us on the bridge when you're ready." "Okay," Keith acquiesced, shuffling off in the direction of Red's hangar. He knew she was fine, but at the moment hers was the only company he wanted. He felt Shiro's eyes on his back as he walked away, monitoring him for weakness and stress, performing some secret diagnosis. It irked him. He sped up. Red growled softly and companionably as he was ever happy to see him. He also felt a bit of unease on her, but unlike with his other teammates, he understood immediately why. She had known he was in trouble. Known, but couldn't get to him. He'd been too far away. She felt like she'd failed him. He put a hand on her giant claw, resting his head against her. "It's all right, girl," he told her, knowing she didn't need to hear him say the words, but wanting to say them anyway. She lowered her head, opening her mouth to invite him in. He obliged, entering the warmth of the cockpit, the soft glow of the display. He curled up on the pilot seat, leaning his head back, enjoying the warmth. Red's consciousness folded over him, and he sighed, relaxed, but not completely. There was a question from the lion. She didn't understand his emotions, why there was anger there, why he wasn't at ease now that he'd been returned. I don't know," he told her honestly. There was no way he could lie. "Everything's weird right now. I don't want to be anywhere or with anyone." Red flashed the color blue all over the display, making him hide his face in his arms, curling into red as if they could just be one entity. He didn't want to think about Lance anymore. He didn't want to admit that he couldn't stop thinking about him. How he wanted him to wake up and be as he was, how he wanted nothing to change. He wanted his space family exactly as he'd gotten used to it, even though he knew that was a silly thing to wish. They were risking their lives, beginning a war to dethrone a tyrannical regime that had been in power for millennia. It was ridiculous to think that their tiny team could do such a thing and come through completely unchanged. And yet, he still wanted it, for as long as it was possible to have. He wanted it, for as long as it was possible to have. "You'll change with them," Red assured him, surprising him with the directness of her communication. It wasn't often that she did more than wrap him with her power. She didn't use words, but sometimes her projections could be translated that way. "Sometimes without realizing," she continued. "Sometimes with pain. To live is to change, and you are very much alive. Don't push them away out of fear of this. Develop together, and you will grow closer. Resist, and you will be left behind." He knew she was right, but knowing something was true was quite a bit easier than pushing down the fear to accept it. "How's Blue?" he asked out loud, folding his arms around his knees, enjoying that they were having a sort of conversation. They were so rare. "Resting," was the answer. She had saved him from being buried in the fall. She had not anticipated being taken down herself, only managing to free herself at the end because of Lance's focus on her, knowing that he was moments from death. She'd been unprepared for the power of the quintessence of the planet. "What?" Keith interrupted the barrage of feelings and images that made up their communication. "What about the quintessence?" What Red presented him next was too complicated for him to translate into proper words. She had not been there, though she'd sensed from the atmosphere before Keith had jumped. The soil of the planet was quintessence. It didn't contain quintessence, like every living thing in the universe. It was the life force. But dust. Petrified. Ancient. Dormant. "That doesn't make sense," Keith said, frustrated. Red projected annoyance at his youth, his tiny, finite mind that couldn't wrap around the cosmos the way hers could. Quintessence doesn't die. It just is. He was misunderstanding her, impossibly. It was not dead, she insisted. More like contained, wrapped in time. It had shut down Blue just by touching her, stealing her force like a parasite, preying on her weakened state caused by Lance's injury. The fall into the canyon had not done anything, as he'd expected. It had been the dust. "So it is dangerous," Keith muttered. He thought back to the planet, how there was nothing alive there, how it crumpled into itself, hollowed out and broken, how breathing in too much of it had given him pneumonia in such a short time. "But Pidge found quintessence in the soil. She said it was like nothing she's ever seen before." What Pidge had seen was Blue's essence, mixed with and animating the original quintessence of the planet. It would not register to her as belonging to Voltron, or to the Blue Lion specifically, as it had been tainted. The soil of the planet had taken it from her, exactly as any blood-sucking life form would. "We can't go back," Keith said quietly. "If any of the lions touch down there, the same thing will happen." Red agreed. Keith thought of the original distress call that had brought them to those coordinates in the first place. They had thought they were coming to the aid of a civilization, a planet needing liberty from the oppressive hand of the Galra. No one ever lived there, did they? What we received was a hail from a crashed ship, wasn't it? Red wasn't sure. She had no way to know, but she thought that it would have been possible for life to have existed there once, maybe long ago. Technically, the entire planet was life, just frozen. "Behave that way," Keith continued. "What happened to it?" This question also tripped Red up. She didn't have to understand why. She hardly ever bothered with it. It just was. There was light, so also there was its absence. There was quintessence, therefore its absence. "But darkness doesn't steal light," Keith protested, getting tired. "Does it not?" Red questioned him. There was matter, and void, and always balance. If matter was introduced to a void, would they not seek level? The quintessence of that place was not sentient, not truly alive anymore, dormant. Active quintessence coming into contact would bleed into it, reanimating it, the way that a body will give of its heat to what it comes into contact with. Sometimes that exchange will result in more heat. others with cooling, depending on which has the most energy, and more heat. Others with cooling, depending on which has the most energy. The planet was not evil, not an active parasite, but by its very nature, it could force anything living to merge with it, seeking that level. If there were enough life, enough active quintessence, like a living net that could surround the entirety of the place with energy, it might reverse it, absorbing the dormant, converting it to energy, and creating new life. But the force required to do such a thing would be beyond their ability to create. How did it get that way? Keith asked again, unwilling to believe that this happened naturally. Was this what became of those planets that Zarkon pulled quintessence from? But if he were draining quintessence from a planet, that would not leave any behind to become dust. Red had no answer. She advised him not to think too much about it. He was no longer there. Rest, she told him. There was no need to fear, Keith told her. The others, I need to tell them this. He stood up, feeling inexplicably heavy. How was he going to make them understand this when he barely grasped it himself? But he had to try. Keith? At first he thought it was Red calling his name as he hurried from her cockpit, struggling down to the hangar floor as though he were pulling weights on him. Keith! All of a sudden he was sitting up, registering low lighting and the softness of the Altean fabric that covered his bunk. He struggled to stand, hating how this was becoming a thing, how he couldn't keep a sense of time and place. Take it easy, you're safe, Shiro calmed from where he sat on the side of Keith's bed. But Keith did not want to take it easy, and he wasn't sure that everyone was safe. How did he even get here? Where were the others? How much time had passed? What's going on? Keith demanded, succeeding in getting to his feet, running his hands over his face. It's okay, Shiro said again. This is normal. I found you asleep in Red's cockpit and thought you'd rest better here. You didn't really wake up, even though I walked you over. I walked here? Now he truly knew how Lance felt losing his memory. He didn't have anything other than talking with Red. He hadn't known he'd fallen asleep. There was no recollection of Shiro coming to Red to get him. There was nothing except the exchange about the quintessence. It was unsettling. Yeah, except I really don't think you were awake, Shiro answered. But you were thrashing just now. What happened? You okay? Yes, Keith said before really thinking about what he was saying. I mean, no. Where is everyone? Karan's on the bridge, monitoring Allura, Pidge, and Hunk. Monitoring? Keith repeated, getting worried and furious at the same time. They didn't. We weren't going to go down there, Shiro explained, holding up his hands. But then the Galra showed up again and landed. Allura and Pidge really wanted to try and see what they're doing there. I stayed to come get you because Lance is almost done with his healing cycle. Since you still need to rest up, you'll stay here with Lance and Karan and provide support while I meet up with the rest of the team on the ground. They took the Lions? Keith asked, internally panicking, understanding that they wouldn't remain functional if they stayed in contact with the dormant quintessence that made up the planet. Or would they? Keith was confused. How much of what he remembered talking about with Red was real? How much of that information could be trusted? Not all of them, just the Green Lion. It weighs the least, and can remain hidden the easiest. I'll be taking a pod that Pidge has installed her cloaking device for. If anything happens, Pidge will buy us the time it will take to get the other Lions. If it comes to that. Most likely, they won't even know we're there, unless we decide to shut the whole thing down. That's not good. Starting to pace. They'd already gone down there before he'd had a chance to tell them what he'd learned. The Green Lion was already on the ground, having her quintessence drained from her while the others were spying on the Galra. They probably had no idea. Keith, I'm getting worried about you. Why are you so worked up about this? It's not me, it's them! They need to come back, now. Karan? He raised his voice to activate the paging system of the castle. Karan's calm face appeared on the monitor in his room. Karan, tell the team to abort the mission. The soil on that planet is dormant quintessence that will absorb the energy from the Green Lion. She won't be able to move if they don't get her off soon. That's not quite how quintessence works, Karan began. You see, get them back up here now, Keith yelled. I'm patching you through, Karan half sighed, and the screen switched to black, audio only. Princess? What is it, Karan? Only. Princess? What is it, Karan? Alura's voice was calm, but Keith could hear the tightness in it. She was unprepared for being disturbed right now. Is everything all right? Allura, he interjected, ignoring the way Shiro was looking at him. Listen, Red told me that the soil of that planet absorbs quintessence. It's taking it from the Green Lion, and probably you, right now. Get everyone in and get off the ground. The Red Lion told you this? Allura questioned, her tone infuriatingly doubtful, but Keith didn't want to get into it. He wanted them safe, far away from here. How? She just did, he said firmly, wanting to make it clear that he wasn't crazy or dreaming or paranoid. There was something wrong with the planet. Come back. Sorry, Karan spoke up, but could one of you head to the medroom? Lance's pod will be opening in another dobosh. I'd go myself, but... We're on our way, Karan, Shiro assured, standing from Keith's bed and staring at Keith. But, Keith said, unsure. He wanted to be in the medroom, but he needed to make sure everyone was understanding what he was saying about the dirt. He couldn't decide which was more important. Come on, Shiro ordered gently, nodding his head toward the door. Karan, please get them to come back, Keith begged as he started toward Lance, knowing already that his warning was going to go unheeded. They were down there. Nothing horrible seemed to be happening. Why should they listen to him? He'd been hurt. He was tired and overreacting. That was just how he was, wasn't it? But it wasn't. He marched angrily toward the medroom, Shiro keeping pace beside him, muttering about how they would have to go rescue them as soon as Lance was settled. Something was going to go wrong. He just knew it. But then he saw Lance in the closed, no indication that the pod would be opening any second now, and he remembered all the other worries he'd managed to push down while he'd been talking with Red. He felt his hands clench at his sides as he tried to hold still and wait. Shiro put a comforting hand on his shoulder, not quite understanding all of what Keith was going through, but giving his support anyway. A light blinked in the pod, and the fluid drained in a rush, followed by rapid oxygen current that served the double purpose of drying off the patient and waking them up. The cover retreated, and suddenly there was nothing between Keith and Lance anymore. Lance raised a hand unsteadily toward the brightness of the lights, blinking quickly. Keith let out a breath as he realized that Lance could see again. Then he took the 2 steps up to the pod to automatically steady Lance, just as Pidge and Hunk had done for him when he'd exited his own pod, grounding him and assuring himself that he was okay now. At the same time, Keith said, I got you. What the hell, Keith? Lance asked, looking at Keith suspiciously, leaning away from where Keith had taken one of his elbows and slipped an arm around his waist. Because for Keith, there was no longer anything like personal space between them. For some reason, it didn't even piss him off to hear Lance speak to him this way. He was just delighted that he remembered his name, that he could see him again. Slowly, he removed his hands, staying close without consciously thinking about it. How are you feeling? Shiro asked. Do you remember what happened? Lance put a hand on his head, his face confused, trying to pinpoint the last of his memories before waking up in the pod. Keith stared at him, waiting expectantly. I'm great, he answered first, half-heartedly, obviously still figuring out the answer to the second question. I remember, falling. Yeah, the ground just crumbled out from under me. And a laugh. He'd forgotten the canyon, all of it. He couldn't remember being blind, almost dying, struggling along the broken pathway, crawling through that tunnel. All of it was wiped clean for him. Part of Keith was happy those memories had been taken from Lance. They were awful. But another part felt sort of betrayed about it. He would forever be the only person who would know exactly what went on down there, how nightmarish it had been. Yeah, I bet it was real funny for you watching me fall, Lance spat, not understanding that Keith was not actually laughing at him. Keith felt his mouth drop open at the accusation, shocked at the venom in Lance's tone. We're glad you're back, Shiro told him genuinely, putting out his hand in a calming gesture and changing the subject before Keith could come up with something to say. Hunk's brought your clothes. He gestured to the neatly folded pile on the table next to him. "And he says he left you both a meal in the kitchen." The table next to him. "And he says he left you both a meal in the kitchen." "He left it?" Lance echoed, looking a little crestfallen that only Shiro and Keith were around. "What do you mean, both of us? Where is Hunk? Where's everyone?" "They're on a mission," Shiro explained, while Keith retrieved the clothes and stuffed them into Lance's hands, needing to do something besides stand still and chat, feeling like he had to prove somehow that he wasn't making fun of Lance, that he didn't think it was funny that he'd been hurt. "One I should actually be on, too." "Don't do that, Shiro," Keith blurted out, shifting his attention instantly, almost dropping the clothes, which Lance was looking hesitant about taking from him. "Don't go down there." Shiro gave him a hard look as Lance snatched his jacket out of Keith's hands. "This is something I have to finish now that it's started," he told Keith, and he understood that Shiro was trying to let him down gently, that he was trying to validate his opinion even though to him it made no sense. "We've been in worse spots and pulled through. The most important thing right now is figuring out what Zarkon wants with that planet." "Don't," Keith begged one more time, knowing it was pointless, keeping one eye on Lance as he ducked out of sight to change, monitoring him for any strange behavior that might have been brought on by his brain injury. "Don't forget that Blue was able to move herself while she was down there," Shiro reminded him. "And we won't be down as long." "What about Blue?" Lance cut in, a bodiless voice, but neither Shiro nor Keith were going to answer him yet. "They need me down there," Shiro told Keith firmly. "You stay with Lance. Both of you eat and rest, you got me? We'll be back before you know it." "Wait, you're not leaving me with him?" Lance broke in, shrugging into his jacket as he came back to stand with them, confused and agitated. Shiro smiled playfully. "You couldn't have a better caregiver." Understood that this statement was as close as he would get to telling Lance what had happened, how Keith had saved him. Keith was glad about that. If he didn't remember on his own, he didn't want anyone to tell him. "Are you kidding me?" Lance squawked. Keith folded his arms, wondering why he'd been so worried that Lance would be different when he woke up. How could he have forgotten how obnoxious he was when he was awake and undamaged? "Keep your helmet visors closed," Keith advised seriously. "Don't breathe the dust." Shiro reached out to clasp his hand, his face openly grateful that Keith was no longer fighting him about the importance of the mission. Keith sighed, hating that he was going to have to support this decision, how no one was taking him seriously enough to heed his warnings about it. "Roger that," Shiro agreed before heading out. "And come back the second you figure out what they're doing. Don't stay any longer than you have to," Keith yelled after him. "What was that all about?" Lance asked, "What was that all about?" Lance asked, turning his head back and forth between Keith and Shiro. Keith took another steadying breath. "Just come on," he said curtly, tugging on Lance's jacket sleeve to pull him forward. At first, Lance dug his heels in, resisting Keith, but gave in with a shrug, following him to the kitchen. In true Hunk fashion, they found a tray set out for them, covered in a cloth, with a little note that probably explained what he'd prepared and how they should eat it. And in true teenaged boy fashion, they both completely ignored it, though Keith noticed that Lance put the note carefully in his pocket with one hand, even as he was picking up a spoon with the other. "I can't believe," Lance began after the first swallow, "that they went on a mission." Keith stared at his bowl, wondering if he would ever get back into a normal rhythm of life-sustaining activity, normal sleep habits, normal hunger patterns. Now that he was standing, his stomach woke up enough to let him know it would be a good idea to eat, but before that, he couldn't remember if he'd been hungry, or maybe he'd just ignored it. "Without us," Lance pointed out, eating a little faster now. Keith tasted the unidentifiable mixture, finding it satisfying in a way he couldn't place. There was something starchy there. Hunk was obviously going for comfort food lately. Keith didn't mind. "Doesn't that bother you?" Lance actually poked him with the handle of his spoon. "Are you even listening?" "We don't all have to be on every single mission," Keith countered. "You just woke up. You're in no shape to fight the Galwa right now." Lance bristled at the comment, his face growing red. Then his countenance calmed into curiosity, into study as he watched Keith eat, trying to make sense of where the world had shifted while he'd been gone. "Why aren't you with them?" he pressed. "What have you been doing that Hunk left you food too?" Keith wasn't that Lance had deducted something was up so quickly, but he still didn't have a response for this that didn't involve a lengthy conversation about their time in the canyon that he just didn't want to get into. "Don't worry about it," he answered lamely. Lance narrowed his eyes, but let it go long enough for them to finish eating. "And I am going, as soon as I get you settled." Lance's eyes were all the way to just slits now, his chest sort of puffed as he breathed in silent fury. "Settled?" He said it like a challenge. Keith didn't take the bait. "Yeah," he said nonchalantly. "Finish your food, and then I'm taking you to your room. You need sleep, like actual rest." Keith had to hide a smile in his bowl as he watched Lance's nostrils flare. It was kind of fun to get him worked up. He'd forgotten that, too. "Hell no!" Lance burst out. "If you're going, I'm going." Keith slammed his bowl on the table, standing up. All his amusement vanished in one worried instant. Lance looked momentarily frightened, but tightened his jaw in determination against whatever Keith was about to do to him. "No way," Keith said vehemently. "You almost died down there. You're staying here with Karan." "You're not the boss of me," Lance finished childishly, setting his own bowl down with a finality that was probably supposed to change Keith's mind. It didn't in the least. "I'm going." "No, you're not," Keith challenged, feeling his hands clench up. Lance stood up quickly, as if to square off with Keith, but he faltered slightly as he straightened. Not much. Not like he did when he was in the canyon, but Keith was watching him too closely for just this sort of thing to miss it. Almost on instinct, Keith grabbed Lance's elbow to steady him, studying him intently as his eyes lost focus for a second. Karan had said there was almost a 50% chance he wouldn't be complete. "What are you doing?" Lance accused as he pulled out of Keith's grip. His balance returned. "Helping you," Keith answered honestly, unnerved. "I don't need your help," Lance returned sharply. "Now leave me alone." Keith knew he shouldn't let it bother him that Lance was behaving this way, but that didn't stop him from standing in shock as he watched Lance head out of the kitchen. When he realized that Lance was likely on his way out of the castle, he hurried after him. "Lance, wait!" he called, jogging to catch him, relieved when Lance allowed him to fall into step beside him. "Don't try to talk me out of it," Lance ordered. "Let's check in with Karan first," Keith suggested. "Figure out what's going on." "What do you think I was doing?" Lance huffed. "Honestly." Keith nodded to himself, strategizing how to keep Lance in the castle, how to convince the ones already on the ground to return, what he could say to persuade them. He hadn't really figured it out when they stepped onto. One was a chart of the ground, monitoring the shifts of the surface, keeping tabs on the stability of the earth beneath the team's feet. The other was a map of where they were in this solar system, a chart of the other planets and stars, their position a blinking green dot, every so often radiating outward in a scan for other moving objects around them. The third was a visual recording of sound waves, 3 distinct lines for each of the team members on the ground. Karan stood with his back to them, keeping a close eye on the first 2 charts, alert to any dangers. Shiro stood before the last, arms crossed, shoulders straight. Keith slumped a little in relief that Shiro had remained in the castle after all. Keith became aware of Shiro just as Karan took notice of Lance. At first, he looked back quickly to register them as he heard them enter. Then he did a double take to see Lance up and dressed. In another second, he'd momentarily abandoned his post to rush the blue paladin, grabbing him tight. with an excited exclamation of, "Thank the ancients!" before dragging Lance back over to the monitors so he could pay attention to all of it at the same time. Shiro looked over his shoulder to nod at Keith before he too went back to his monitor. Keith silently came to his side. "Keith and Lance are here," Shiro informed the other 3. "Lance?" Hunk gushed. "Lance, buddy, you good?" "Fine," Lance answered, smiling from where Karan still had his hand protectively around his wrist. "You need me down there?" "Not at present," Allura answered, calmly, but still with tension in her voice. I'm afraid we're a bit trapped until the Galra leave here if we don't want to start a battle. Having one of you come down would undoubtedly draw more attention than we want. We aren't quite finished either. That explained why Shiro was still here. What's happening? For Squint. There's just the one warship, a fighter, landed where we'd originally intended to pick you up. We've been forced to retreat into the canyon a bit to avoid being seen. Keith willed his breathing to remain steady. They couldn't be that far into the canyon, not far enough to be in too much danger. Pidge has been collecting samples and running scans on the soil, Shiro added. Apparently it changes depending on what it comes into contact with. Seeking level, Keith thought, but didn't have time to explain what he'd learned from Red. And apparently Zarkon's witch is doing much the same thing, Allura went on. She's here with a sizable guard. It looks as though she's trying to manipulate the soil, except she seems to have something specific in mind. Whatever it is, she's having little success. Hagar is there? Shiro confirmed, his voice tinged with something dark, the resurgence of a repressed memory. I thought you said there were only soldiers. There were. She only recently joined them outside, Allura continued. We just can't make out any reason why. We should take them out, Keith suggested, feeling jittery, not enjoying standing calmly on the bridge like this. You guys take cover, and the three of us will just destroy the whole place. He noticed Lance's look as he spoke, a confused expression combined with something like patient endurance. He knew what he was thinking, that Keith's first reaction was always to rush in, guns blazing. But in this case, he really didn't think it was such a bad idea. We can't do that, Pidge returned the frustrating denial. Keith folded his arms, wondering if all his plans were going to be shot down for the rest of eternity. They're between us and the lion. We'd have to somehow climb up and go around the back, which, as you know, isn't really possible. Hey, who's that? Hunk asked. Looks like they're bringing out a hostage. Maybe one of the original inhabitants here? Pidge guessed. Hostage. Maybe one of the original inhabitants here? Pidge guessed. No, I don't think so, Allura countered. He's obviously Galra. So not a hostage? Shiro asked with an edge to his voice, and Keith noticed his fingers drumming along his arm. He was getting antsy too. Maybe not, but he's not part of Hagar's guard either, Pidge answered, thinking out loud as she narrated. They've got him on the ground with their weapons on him. Hagar's talking to him. It looks like they want him to do something, but he's shaking his head. She's furious. I think you should get out of there, Keith repeated, tapping his foot without realizing it, forgetting that they didn't really have a safe escape route while Hagar was blocking their way. He keeps looking at the green lion, Pidge continued, her voice inquisitive and the tiniest bit anxious. She's cloaked, though, isn't she? Shiro checked, his hands coming to his sides, preparing for something. He could feel it, too. Something very wrong. Something he wouldn't be able to prevent. Lance's shadow entered the corner of his vision as he came to stand with them, watching their teammates' words rise and fall on the waves of the monitor. Of course, Pidge answered, but he keeps looking that way. Get down! The spike of the wave shot the intensity of Pidge's command through the bridge, making Lance actually duck just as instructed. Karan looked over, then back to his own monitors. Shiro took a step forward. Keith felt as though he was at breaking point for holding still, for waiting. Just standing here listening to what was going on, depending on words to give them a picture of the situation, was almost physically painful. Do you think he saw us? Hunk asked. Be on guard there, Karan broke in. I'm picking up some activity on the surface of the planet. Rock slide? Keith asked uneasily. No. Ripples, Lance repeated. What does that even mean? What sort of planet is this? Where'd he go? Came Hunk's whispered question, completely spooked. Guys? The Galra on the ground just disappeared? The muted shots of blasters came through faintly over the radios. The Galra were shooting at something. Is there any way you can get to the lion? Shiro said urgently. I think it's time to abort. But just as the words left his mouth, there was a shout from Allura and Karan. Keith turned from the jolted wavelength to Karan's monitor of the planet, where an entire section of ground was giving way.